Hello and welcome to another live hangout on Living Income Guaranteed. This week we have guest hosts here today filling in for Marlene, who will be back next week. There's myself, Kelly from Seattle area in Washington, and we also have Joe Koo visiting us from California. Hi, Joe.
Hi, everybody.
And today in this hangout, we're going to be looking at the topic of money. So let's talk about money. What is it? What does it mean to us? How do we value it? What does it mean that as we're becoming more aware that our money is a debt-based system, what does that really mean? How do we approach that? So to start us off with that topic, let's go to you, Joe, and give us an overview on that.
All right. Thank you, Kelly. For many of us who have been looking at this issue of money for some time now, most of us are aware of money being debt. And when we say, oh, money is debt, we don't kind of have to think twice anymore. We already understand what that is. But there are still a lot of people who may not have gotten that understanding. So today we're going to open that up first, talking a little bit about what money is and what does it mean that money is debt. For those who don't know, most of the, well, I would say all of the money that is in circulation right now is based on debt, because the money doesn't come from the government that prints it for you as a service, as a common good, or as a store of value. Money actually exists through private banks who print this money for profit. So in order for us to get the benefit of using this money as our currency, we actually have to pay back for that benefit in the form of interest. Meaning, anytime money is created for our use, it is created with the forethought that we're going to give you this money, but you're going to pay us back plus interest. Now, this plus interest is where things get really sticky, because let's slow this down, okay? So let's say I'm the private bank and you, Kelly, are the government of the nation of Kelly, and you need a currency system to facilitate the trade and the exchanges within your country. You need something stable, something that you can use that'll be the same, and you need a lot of it because you've got a lot of people. Now I can come in as this private entity and say, hey, guess what? I've got this printing system. I can make all of your currency for you, and you can use it for everything that you need. But in order for you to use this, you got to pay me back for my services to you. I'm providing you the service of creating this money. So you're going to have to pay me back. Now, the problem is, if I'm creating all the money you're using, but I'm not creating the interest on top that you owe me, where are you going to get the interest to pay me back? So this is where things get creative. And I can say, oh, well, you know, I'm a nice guy. I see that you don't have enough money to pay me back my interest. Why don't you just give me part of your country? Why don't you let me just be part of your government? Why don't you give me special benefits and favors and privileges that other people don't get, because, you know, I'm doing you this service and after all, you owe me. So this is kind of a parodied mentality. Of course, I'm paraphrasing a lot of history here, but this is, believe it or not, how our money system works. This is how money is created. Money, as long as it's coming from the current private banking system, is created out of nothing, is borrowed into existence, and then we have to pay back all of the money that's created plus interest. And this interest is never printed. This interest doesn't exist. In other words, every dollar that comes into existence already owes itself another dollar. So how do we pay it back? Can we pay it back? This is the meat of today's topic. This is why money is debt. Because if we actually paid back all of the debt that we owe, there would be no money in circulation. Without debt being the premium on top of money, there would be no money. So Kelly, let me throw this back to you. Does this make sense to you? I mean, am I explaining it wrong? Is this not how money is created? What is your feedback?
Yeah, well, that's a great point because it's almost so ridiculous that it's hard to believe that it would be that simple. Fortunately, it is really simple, though, to kind of, when you break it down to that basic level of what's happening, where for every dollar that we have, we owe on it, and it just can't make sense. It's almost like the game of musical chairs, where you have so many people and not enough chairs. You know, it's just bad math. But so yeah, let's look at how this affects us on an individual level. What does it really mean? I mean, there's so many dimensions to that. So, but fundamentally, it means that we're always living in debt. We're always living in a perpetual state of owing something. So in this, it becomes a form of enslavement because we always owe. We always owe. And in this, it's also a way that keeps us perpetually moving, if you will. It forces us to have to keep continuing to create some kind of value in whatever way we can, because we always have to be paying things back. So it kind of creates this reverse situation where we're not really here living and being able to create value in a positive way, but always having to kind of make up for what we already owe, what we already owe. And this affects us on so many levels, where life, when you look at it and what it really means to live in this world as it is, and when you're not sugarcoating it and trying to put a pretty lining on it, it's really tough. Economic stress is probably one of the biggest sources of stress that there is today in society, and it underpins everything that we do, because you need money to live. You need money to do the things that matter. It's kind of like that song, money, it's what I want. And she says, something about, your love is great, but it won't pay my bills. I want money, and we kind of look at that like, oh, it's greedy, you want money. But really, no, honestly, you need money to live in this world and have a dignified life. And when you don't have enough of that, when you're living in perpetual debt and our wages aren't such to match that, it creates a lot of stress, suffering, all kinds of debilitating effects that we see today. I mean, so much of what is going on in society as the problems we have come back down to that basic money point. And it's funny how it works, because it kind of creeps along slowly, where, not so many years ago, people kind of you could have one person working and one person at home with the kids, and that was okay. And then it became so that both parents had to work, and now it's that everyone's in debt. Everyone. It's like ubiquitous. But it creeped along, and so we kind of didn't really notice it. So that's kind of what we're here today doing, is to kind of take a step back and look at this with like fresh eyes and say, like, look, this is crazy. This is ridiculous. It shouldn't be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. And it only exists because of that fundamental, basic bad math point where we've accepted that somehow we can borrow this money and then have to pay it back and give more. And within that, it's kind of like we didn't accept ourselves as valuable. Like, we've accepted ourselves as having to owe. We've accepted that concept. So yeah, that's what we're trying to break through the veil today, to show that, like, look, this is ridiculous. It really shouldn't be this way. We're just living as debt slaves and not really living.
Yeah, absolutely. To get a bit into the meat of this, I think we want to provide just a little bit more of the historical context before we jump into the modern day issue. And of course, there's a lot of history behind the founding of the Federal Reserve, what happened in 1913, where basically there was, like you said, a point in history where in America you were able to, have one person be the breadwinner and have a job and come home with that single income and be able to provide for everything. But somewhere along the line, that seems to have shifted, hasn't it? It definitely is not that today. And throughout the course of monetary history in the United States, something very interesting happened. At one point in our history, we separated ourselves from the real value that was backing our dollar. And when that happened, it allowed us to do something fantastic, which is, if there is nothing real backing the dollar anymore, all that's left is the faith and trust of the public and the people who have already bought into the dollar internationally to keep this currency afloat, to give it its new value. So its new value at that point became imaginary. It became an issue of convenience, right? Because we've already trusted and invested in the dollar as having value. If you take the real value away, well, we don't have an alternative. We're going to have to keep using this dollar. And when that happened, the miraculous thing was we kept it afloat by even more illusion, even more faith, blind trust in this system of fractional reserve banking, where money is created out of debt. And the only way to keep the money in circulation is to keep charging interest or keep generating more and more debt. Because if you want to keep the dollar afloat, that's fine. You're still going to have to pay us, the private banks, back. And we're going to keep giving you money. Oh, you can't pay us back? Well, you're going to need more money to pay us back from last time. So let's give you more money. But you're going to have to pay us back more. Oh, you can't pay us back again? Well, guess what? We're going to give you more money, and then next time you'll pay us back more. But there's never enough more. They never give you the more to pay back with. And what happens more and more is you see that people are the ones that are footing the bill. And it isn't us paying back, because we can't print money. We can't say, I have value as a human being based on this, based on my potential. Let me issue these Joe dollars, and these Joe dollars are good for my worth during my time on earth, and these are backed by my substance, backed by my value. Take these and pay off my debt. No, that's illegal. It's illegal when we do it. So more and more you see debt becoming a part of our lives, to such a point where it's become so familiar to us that we no longer recognize it as the problem that it is. And there's a quote I wanted to share that kind of illustrates this point. And this is a quote from Leo Tolstoy, a Russian author. And the quote is this: "Money is a new form of slavery, and distinguishable from the old simply by the fact that it is impersonal, that there is no human relation between master and slave." And I think that's very relevant for us to use as a springboard into today's discussion. Kelly, do you have any feedback on that?
Yeah, so that's a great quote, because it kind of illustrates how money and our unspoken accepted relationship to it has become the point of enslavement, where it's impersonal now. You can't so much point at someone like a slave master, and say that person is enslaving me, or it's become such that now it's just a sort of a ubiquitous accepted thing within how the money itself is valued as being debt. Because it's interesting, we think of money as having value, but when you realize that debt function of how we always owe on it, you could actually look at a dollar as being a negative value, as having negative value. That dollar literally is it looks like a dollar. It says one on it, but it's less than that. You know, it's interesting. It's almost like a trick of the mind. You know, like magic. But so yeah, I mean, if you look at what we had happen historically in the United States with slavery, and when slavery was supposedly abolished, it's kind of told that way in school. It's kind of simplified the history of it, like, oh, we had slavery and then we abolished it, but it's not really explained. It's not really explained, like, what did that really mean, and what really happened, and did it really end? Especially when you consider the fact that we're all still very much enslaved today. You know, you can't just go out and do whatever you want, you know, or even pick whatever job you want. For most people, that's the case. So when slavery was abolished, I mean, it went from being more of the slave owner being the one in charge to now you need to have a job to make money, so you still have to work for that slave owner probably. And now you're a slave to the money that you need to survive. So it's become very impersonalized in that it's sort of, there's nothing to really point at and say, oh, who, you know, and blame, like, as to who's made that decision, or it's now underlying, and it implies that it's going to be up to us to kind of realize that, and realize that we have to change how we value ourselves, change how we value our living, our lives, and change the value, the way the money system is valued, so that it's not a debt system, a debt slavery system, which will obviously be not a quick, easy thing. It's not going to be a quick fix to that, because it's become such that now it's become dependent. The system is actually dependent on that, like you were saying, just because of that inherent acceptance of value, or a lack of value. We have to consistently keep the engines going to keep meeting that debt. And just as you see this on a national level, you have this on the individual level as well, where now it's credit cards are offering, you know, 0% APR for the first 12 months, you know, transfer your balances, transfer your debt.
Right, and debt consolidation schemes where, you know, they'll tell you, oh, you have 7 credit cards that are due and you can't afford them. We'll combine it all into one,
Yeah.
and we'll give you a lower rate on that. But
Yeah.
it doesn't
Or
address refinancing, yeah, and all of these underwater homes and mortgages. It can seem daunting to kind of try to understand all of these economic things, right? But it actually isn't. It's actually very simple. I think a lot of the confusion comes from people trying to look at it as though it's supposed to make sense. But it isn't. It is functional. When you understand that the mechanism by which the money comes into being is designed such that it takes value out of people and siphons it away and leaves the people with basically the garbage, the refuse. An example of this would be, you know, the elite, or the owners, the controllers, the current slave masters of the world get the benefit of your labor, your time, the resources of the planet, all of the processing that goes into making all the goods. That's the real value. That's the real stuff. But what do you get in return? You get a receipt. You get a coupon that says you can redeem this for X amount of value, and you can do this because we have laws that say this is legal tender. By law, you are forced to be able to accept this for your debts. Okay, so they're giving you all of the excess, all of the waste product, all of the things that happen after the real stuff has been taken away. I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I just thought that was just such a, I mean.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, it ties back into that slavery point too, because it's like what happened was we externalized the costs. You know,
Yes.
the costs of slavery, instead of the slave owner being in charge of making sure that they have food and clothing. Now it's on the slave. You know, it's your responsibility. to take care of yourself. And it's just like what happens on a national level as well with globalization and jobs being outsourced, and the way that value works in the industrial system as well, because you have to mine resources, the very basic resources that we make all of our products from. That labor is very cheap. It's like the cheapest paid labor. The goods are the cheapest, and as it goes through production processes up into the final product, that's where the highest markup comes and the highest profits are made when whoever's putting the finishing touches on, and then selling it in the store. It's kind of ironic because you have that the hardest and most difficult and often most abusive labor is like the least valued. It's like totally a backwards system where every step of the way the product is being sold until it gets to the end product, and it's sort of another way of inflating value because you're kind of just adding the value instead of but in the end you're getting just the one product, and it's the same. It kind of ties back to another point of when we were looking at how the debt is kind of perpetual and you have to keep replacing it with more debt. It's the same function in terms of how you have to basically, oh wait, I've lost my train of thought. Well, maybe we'll come back. So from here, why don't we move on to, I think you had another quote to look at that was really good. So why don't we look at that?
Yeah. Well, I had a few. The other one I wanted to bring up was, it goes like this. This is the quote. The modern theory of the perpetuation of debt has drenched the earth with blood and crushed its inhabitants under burdens ever accumulating. What this is talking about is the exponentially increasing nature of debt that we currently have. I think it was Albert Einstein who said that compound interest was the greatest force in the universe. And that is so right, because that's what we're seeing. It is the ever accumulating burden of debt. And it's ever accumulating because within the setup of the current system, there is no way to pay down the debt. There is no way to if you have to pay back your principal plus interest, and there exists no interest with which to pay back, you will perpetually be in debt. But because
who said that quote? That last.
I'll get into that real quick.
Okay.
The reason why I didn't say who's because this quote is so relevant today. But this quote actually came from Thomas Jefferson. So
I love that because it's kind of such a brutal quote. You would think it's from somebody really radical, or
Well, actually, at the time, during that period in history, there was a lot of tension that was coming from the banking system and the finances of the newly forming United States. And it's to not make this into a history show, but to give you some context, Andrew Jackson was I think he was the only president to successfully disband the private fractional banking system, because he saw, and a lot of the founders knew and understood this, and this was actually part of the reason for the American Revolution. It wasn't because of the Boston Tea Party and this stuff that we were told in history classes. No, a lot of it actually had to do with the fact that we were not being allowed to make our own currency, and that we were being put into this financial serfdom that the founders knew would lead to enslavement. So, those founding fathers at that time already saw the dangers of what happens when people are not able to create their own currency and be in control of that, and what happens when the issue of a nation's currency falls into private hands. And a lot of our history has been revolving around this theme. And that isn't taught in schools, and that's very unfortunate. For those of you who want references, I'm happy to provide those. send me a message and I'll provide some links as well in this video. But yeah, that quote was from Thomas Jefferson, and that just shows how even today we're still relating to that point of ever accumulating burden that's put upon our shoulders because of the financial system, and specifically the issue of money as debt that seems like such an important part of our history that I find it strange that we need to have this conversation. But Kelly, what is your
Yeah.
feedback on that?
Yeah, that's true. Well, and I also remembered the point that I was going to go into before, which was that point of the ever-revolving credit, and how what happens is it's even bigger than we realize, because it's not even just simply the creation of the money as debt and then we have to pay it back with interest, but it's even all this credit that as individuals we're taking out. Money is created there because those loans are not actual money. Those loans are created out of nothing.
So walk me through that, if you could. How does that work? What goes on when somebody goes to a bank? Let's say, okay, I'm going to you at the bank and I want to take out a loan. Where doesn't that money come from somebody's savings?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that because of the fractional reserve system that was put into place in, I forget what it was, it 1913 or somewhere around there.
Mm-hmm. That was when the Federal Reserve banking system was chartered, I believe.
Right. And so yeah, it's been kind of this long game that's been being played step by step to get into the money system, as it was seen like, oh, if we control the money, and every step of the way it's been kind of breaking down regulations and putting in new regulations that kind of support this ability to manipulate the value of money. So what happens is now is when you go to get a loan, banks are allowed to take what money they have in the form of actual money deposits and inflate. They can create money inflated based on that amount, like 90%. They only need to have 10%. They can create 90% more value out of nothing, under the premise that nobody comes to the bank to claim all the reserve money at once. It's usually left there, and so it's apparently safe to create all this extra value. So what happens is when we go to get a loan, that money is created out of nothing. It's not even money. It's because it never even enters really a physical form.
And I think that's something that's really important to touch on here, because a lot of people may have the conception that money is the physical stuff that circulates between people. No, the majority of money now actually exists only digitally. A great percentage of the money has never physically existed. And what happens is, like you were saying, when somebody goes to a bank and they want to take out a loan, the money that is going to that loan doesn't come out of somebody's savings or some vault in the back. It is computing them as data, as information, and this data and information is put out there as the currency. So you are literally creating money out of nothing, out of vapor.
Yeah. It's funny because when I
just to wrap it up, but
mm-hmm.
if there's a bank run, okay, if everybody wants to get physical possession of their value that was created, can they all do that? No, absolutely not. But what'll happen is, if one of the major banks gets in trouble, what do we already know the government's going to do? They're going to say, they're too big to fail. We can't let the bank fail. We need the bank. So we're going to, whatever bad debts you've made, whatever risks you've taken on the bad loans you've issued out, we'll front the bill for it because we can't let you fail. And what kind of message do you think that sends to banks in terms of their lending practices, in terms of their judge whether or not they should be making these loans? So
yeah, that's a really good point, because Uh, and it kind of brings us into the point of how we're dependent on the money system as it is. You know, we can't, the tendency when you realize what's going on and how ridiculous it is, the tendency is to just, is kind of to get angry and, you know, like, what? And you know, and want to just, like, change it right away, like, or fix it. But the thing is, it's become so ingrained within our economy and how it works, and our economy is how we get our living, our livelihood. You know, you can't just cut it out. You can't just demolish it, because we're going to demolish our lives if we do that. It's connected, and that's how this system has kind of been allowed to perpetuate as it is, because it's always been about, we're protecting the livelihood of people, you know, because
Right.
that because of that union of our lives and the economic system, you can't just, you know, demolish it, because you're taking us all down, you know.
And that's a
So
really great point there, and that kind of leads into the last phase of our discussion today, which is, what is the effect of living under such a system? Because at the moment, this is our life support system, but at the same time, it's killing the majority of us. So we're in this kind of rough situation where we are starting to realize that this system is actually taking everything real away from us, but without it, we may have nothing. Uh, and this brings us to the last quote that I wanted to share, which is, death is not the greatest loss in life. The greatest loss is what dies inside us while we live. And I think that's pertinent, because I think that's what's happening within a lot of us. We seem to be living in a world system where our only function seems to be servicing all of this debt. So in a way, we're like the walking debt, right? We are not actually living. We're walking machines that service the debt through going to the military, going to jail, serving our time, paying our debt back to society, or working all those jobs and getting our paycheck. When all the while, all of this activity is actually going towards what? Paying back all of these, I would say, usurious loans, these onerous debts that are foisted on us. We are creating and paying for our own enslavement. What do you say about that, Kelly?
yeah, it's so true. I mean, because the fractional reserve banking system actually even kind of extends to human beings when we're born. You know, this is something that's becoming a little more well known about the money system and how it works, how the loans that, say, the country gets for itself are based on the human beings living in it as the surety for the loan. So based on how many human beings there are, every time a human being is born, it means you can loan more, you can borrow more money. The country can borrow more. So we've actually become really, literally walking debt. Like, we're living debt ourselves. A human being now becomes debt, just like the dollar represents $1. It says $1, but it's really less. We've even become that ourselves, because now we are tied in. Our value, the value that we'll create in our life, is tied in to that system and has to pay back the debt. Because it's one thing to say we've got to pay back the interest with money, but we don't. It's not actually money that we're paying it back with. It's our lives. It's our
Yes.
value, because the money only represents our work, our labor. So it's like we are committing ourselves to living in debt, and which we can never repay. And this leads to all kinds of consequences where, especially those who are in the least valued labor sections, because we don't have an equal value of our labor, suffer some of the most consequences. Often not being able to afford proper health care, and also being relegated to harsh physical conditions that are damaging to the physical body, causing consequences that cannot be reversed. without the means to even medically treat themselves effectively, on top of the mental aspects of this as well.
Absolutely.
So the consequences, and those are the, that's the extreme end of consequences. But there's a whole spectrum of, things like not having time to spend with your family, or, all the decisions that you have to make in relation to not having the money or not having the time. I mean, the job situation has been becoming increasingly worse. We've had larger movements, supporting the $15 an hour minimum wage and this and that, because it's becoming ridiculous now that nobody can support themselves. I mean, we're creating all this value. The math is really off, because with all the work that we're doing, we should be living fine,
More than fine, I would say.
I mean, the saying that many hands make light work should apply. If with all of us working so much, things should be really, we should all be a lot better off. But the problem is that value being siphoned away.
And that's an interesting point too. That aspect of what is value. It seems as though we get put into the wrong side of the equation. For example, today when we're working in a marketplace or working for a company, if we were in a setup where we're cooperating with other companies to make the best product possible, and that was the goal, in the current system, that would be a terrible idea. Why? Because you would not make very little profit. And the system cannot abide that. The system has to constantly generate more and more profit. So we are working actually against our favor. We are born, there's a biblical saying, right? You're born in sin. You're starting in sin. Okay, in this world, we are starting in debt. The moment you are born, you are actually created as a bonded entity. All right, a bond is issued to you. You enter this world as a product that is servicing the greater debt. And there's actually a lot of documentation on this. I'm not speaking metaphorically here. This actually is what happens. But we seem to be on the wrong side of that equation, right? Everything that we do isn't for us anymore. It's that moment that we enter the world, everything that we are going to do is already kind of calculated in and budgeted towards paying back this fantastical debt, this thing that we owe to our God now, which is, and it used to be sin. Now it's debt. What must I do to relieve this debt? What good works must I do? Right? Yeah. So we do have a question coming in. This is coming in from Cousin Carl. Thank you for tuning in and watching. Your question is, do you believe the transition to intangible currency will overtake physical currency in time? Kelly, let me throw that to you first.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say, coincidentally in my life, I almost never carry cash on me, which leads to some annoying situations sometimes. But so it's hard to say, exactly how that's going to go, because it's really going to depend on how we collectively decide to approach money creation at this whole point, as we become more aware of how this works, to a point where we could actually then start to decide how we want to do this. There's certainly a lot of individuals who there's a lot of fear towards the point of going into non-physical money, but we have a lot of non-physical monies also starting out, that, like the Bitcoins and these things, which are kind of serving as an interesting stepping stone into seeing what can be done there. It's a little tricky because, as you were saying before, Joe, there's laws in place in terms of what money can be used where and how, which which would be something to get into in another hangout, perhaps, in terms of like how you've got the reserve currency and how that.
There's an enforcement behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the alternative currencies, there currently is no enforcement other than collective agreement.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in terms of if we'll stick to something physical. I mean, certainly there's a lot of impracticalities in relation to physical money. If you've ever worked as a cashier and you're handed crumpled up bills and stuff and people are fiddling in their wallets and there's a line and all. But yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, I think, in terms of what we'll decide and how that'll go.
Well, my take on this question, Cousin Carl, is I think the more important question here is what principles will be used as the foundation for whatever currency becomes the dominant currency, whether that's tangible or intangible. I think that's something that we can kind of address and work with. There's room for, there's pros and cons to each. I think what has to happen is, for example, we talk a lot about interest being used in a usurious way where you can never pay back the interest, and because of that, you're enslaved forever. But interest itself, I don't think is wrong. I think the problem comes when an institution says, I'm going to pretend I have $10 million to lend to you. I'm going to create that out of nothing at no risk to myself, and you're going to have to pay that back to me plus interest that doesn't exist in the world. I think that is the issue. Now, whether we're using a physical or intangible currency, I think that is a side issue when we're looking at the principle of what value is, and that the value should always be in service of the individual and of life, rather than being seen as a parasite that kind of drains us. So I hope that kind of opens that up. Cousin Carl, thank you for tuning in, and thank you for the question. Again, for everybody out there, we are live, and if you have any questions or comments, do fire them away.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll just add that or restate that yeah, the point of whether it's physical or non-physical is really just kind of going to be a cosmetic thing, in terms of what do we feel like works better. But it's the value point that is the real underlying issue. It's going to be how do we value the money that's going to have the real importance in that. So let's, as we're wrapping up towards our time here, let's look at how
solutions.
Yes, solutions. What do we do? Oh, and that's perfect. We have a comment here from Leanne Gale saying, so where we go from here? Do we have any solutions, debt strike, alternative currencies? So you want to start off with this one, Joe?
Sure. So where do we go from here? Do we have any solutions? Debt strike, alternative currencies? Yes and no to all of those. And I say that because there is no magic bullet solution to this. I think the first step that we need to take is actually education, because we have to understand how we got here and why where we're at is a problem. And if we're not really understanding that, we run the risk of repeating the same mistakes. So where do we go from here? The first step, I would say, is awareness, education, empowering yourself to understand the real version of history, specifically when it comes to our history of money, and from that to help educate others. In terms of a debt strike, I mean, if we really play out that scenario and everybody goes on strike and says, we're not going to pay this debt, this is onerous debt, this is fraudulent debt, we don't want any part of it. That's fine and good, but do we have an alternative in place that's going to support everybody while we are doing that debt strike? Now, I am not here saying that a debt strike is good or bad. What I'm saying is we really need to have a clear understanding that the current system, while it is not good, while it is actually siphoning our lives away, it is the only life support system that's currently existing. Now, if we're going to transition out of that, we need to first come to an agreement about what the alternative is going to be. That alternative could be a basket of different currencies. That could be a new bartering system. That could be a revolution in Bitcoin technology. It could be any of those. Personally, I'm not tied to any one. I'm more interested in the principle of the thing. So I hope that, I know that doesn't answer the question, but I hope that gives you perspective on my take on it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because if I can make an analogy, it's kind of like, say, the money system is your heart and your bloods and your veins and all that, the circulatory system that distributes your resources and whatnot. So if your heart was not functioning properly, are you just going to cut it out? You know, you're still depending on that heart. You know, you need to maybe get a heart transplant or, you know, help the heart. You can't just cut these things out, or, you know, you can't take such extreme measures without considering that we are actually dependent on it still, and therefore we have to find ways that work holistically with how our global economic body exists currently, because it has become intertwined, has become dependent. So we have to take that into consideration when considering what kind of movements to take and actions to do. We have to look at what's the effect going to be. Is it going to actually be a positive effect, or is it going to just create more damage? And like you're saying, this is probably going to come from a lot of different areas. The solutions are going to come from a lot of different ways, probably not just one. But we're, you know, as humanity, we're going to have to try different things and see what we can do and see what works, because the thing is, we've never done it before. We've never had solutions. We've never done this. So we can't say that there's going to be one magic bullet or one path that's going to get there. We have no idea, because we're trying this out for the first time. So we're going to have to try things. There's going to be mistakes. Some things won't work. In it all, we just have to focus on the goal, which is to stop living as debt and be able to really live. Yeah, so hopefully that answers that question. And we have another comment here, it looks like from Cousin Carl. He's saying, I've lived debt-free for 21 years based on devising a budget, making necessary purchases, implementing a discipline of saving for unnecessary purchases. Old saying, people spend what they make, holds true. Living within means is essential. Do you want to address that comment?
Sure. And now I'm going to take you to task on this one, Cousin Carl, so bear with me. So, yes, in the current context, right, budgeting, living within your means, making smart decisions, being financially literate are important, right? They are the keys to having successful living and not being burdened by what's commonly referred to as debt. When I say that, I mean, you know, having to take out loans, or having to rely on credit cards, or having something you need to be paying back, right, to live debt-free, which you've been able to do within the current system. Well, that's well and good. But the fact that you are still using a Federal Reserve-backed money system means you actually are, in the fuller sense, still living in debt as debt. Because remember, you may be able to do what you're doing, but it is coming at a cost to you. It is coming at the cost of you having to still rely on the current system to be afloat. And for the current system to be afloat, it must continually generate more debt. Now, debt isn't always something that you take out from a bank, or it's not always a credit card. It's not always a loan that's you're taking on. Debt is the physical currency that you're using, the US dollar that you're using. It's based on promises of debt that has to be repaid. So I'd like to invite you to expand that perspective a bit and just kind of realize, you know, debt has been given a very narrow definition for a very good reason, because it prevents people from questioning the validity of the money system, right? So we're trained to question, oh, well, I don't have to take on credit cards. I don't need that debt. That's debt. But we forget that the entire monetary system is debt, right? So Yes, living within your means, that's great. Being able to not have to rely on and burden yourself with debt, that's awesome. But I would say we can have an alternative system where none of that is an issue. I mean, why does it have to even be an issue of having to budget yourself in order to have the basic things? The basic things that you need as a human being are the same for everyone else. So why are we allowing a system to dictate to us, hey, if I need to have a basic dignified life, I need to make do with less, and I need to budget, and I need to do this and do that? That isn't living. And that is the consequence of not recognizing the effect of debt as money. I would invite you to ponder that. Kelly?
That's a great point, because it's like, even if a few manage to find a way within it all to make it like work, and eke it out, it's still not representative of the whole majority who can't necessarily do that. It's a tendency we have to say, oh, because one or a few managed, that then it's working, for everyone? Or, like, what about everyone else? We tend to kind of see it in reverse, where actually there's a majority that it's not working for. So it doesn't really matter that maybe one or two has managed. It's kind of irrelevant, because we're looking at the whole picture, and it needs to work for everybody. Because for many, with not having with having such low wages and things like that, for so many, their means isn't actually enough, to get by. And that's why we have so many who end up in impossible situations. It's not all because of they made bad choices and they didn't budget effectively. Sometimes things happen in life where you had no control and you had no buffer, and you're on the street, or worse, medical debts and things like that from genetical issues that you were just born with. I mean, there's so many variables when it comes to human lives, and we tend to kind of forget sometimes that there is so much variety, and we tend to kind of look at things from our one life, our one perspective, like, oh, I managed to make this work in my life, so then it's all good, right? But really, it's not so cookie cutter, and we have to consider that, is it really working for the majority? Because obviously it's not, in this case. So, but, that being said, I mean, if you managed in this system to, make it work and do all that work to manage it, that's cool. I mean, it's cool from a personal perspective. Like, if I've managed to be doing okay and budgeted myself and whatnot and made practical decisions that supported me in my situation, that's definitely cool. We just have to remember that we're looking at everybody here, and whether it's working for everybody.
Right. Just to cap off that point, I would add in this last bit, which is that you might be debt free, and I'm not making this personal. I'm talking about all of us, and we're all in this together. A person can be debt free, right? But they are still a wage slave. So that's not actual freedom, because you're still depending on having a means to earn an income, I'm assuming. Or you may be fortunate enough to be living on savings or investments, but where do those come from? Those also come from debt, especially investments. That's nothing but promises and gambles on debt. So really, let's expand that and consider that we can, if we decide to educate ourselves and get together and say with unity that there are basic principles that should never be infringed upon, that our money system should never be usurious, should always be in the service of making our lives better, not putting us into constant fear of survival or having to make do with less just to make things work. I would say let's challenge all of those definitions. And for all of those who are interested, you can check out the information we have at the Living Income Guaranteed page, which will be included in the description box. We are unfortunately out of time today. We've run a little bit long, but I think we had a great conversation. And do check us out every week. We will be back next week again with your host, as usual, Marlene. I hope she'll be back and ready to go next week. If not, somebody else will be here. Kelly, any last closing comments?
Nope, but just, follow the links that we'll provide in terms of educating on how this money system works so that we can explore holistic solutions like the living income guaranteed.
Great. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Kelly, for hosting. And we will see you when we see you. Thanks for tuning in.
Yep. Bye.